The Iranians have gone to a lot of trouble in training Hamas for this operation, and some of the techniques and imagination that they displayed, I'm absolutely convinced came from the IRGC. So that's the expansion number one that we should be most concerned about.
Well, earlier tonight, I spoke with General Jack Keane. He's the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. He's a retired four-star general and former vice chief of staff of the US Army. And I asked him to tell me about the diplomatic effort it would have taken to get that border open.
Well, certainly this has been a very frustrating issue. So our audience understands urban warfare is very challenging under any circumstance. But in urban warfare throughout most of our history, from World War II to the present, when the forces who are defending meet the forces who are attacking, usually most of the people in that city or in that town, with some exceptions, are gone, because there's been plenty of preparation with guns, artillery, air power, to warn people indirectly they got to get out of there. What makes Gaza so unique and different is the fact that there's a couple of million people that are trapped and not able to get out of there, which drives these casualties up exponentially. So even getting the foreign nationals out through the Rafah port of entry is significant. And look how long it's taken to get that to take place. I really think it's really regrettable that Egypt has not consented to set up refugee camps in the Sinai, which is right outside the Rafah gate. The UN and the Arabs, UN can run it with NGOs. The Arabs can pay for it, and they're willing to. But al-Sisi is very concerned about security and Hamas coming through the border. I think he's overdoing it. Hamas has had a relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, who he deposed, if our audience recalls, and he's concerned about that. But Hamas's focus is not on Egypt. They have a singular focus that makes them a very different terrorist organization, and that is the destruction of Israel.
Jack,
and that's the simple fact of it.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about that security situation. The UK Foreign Office has said that the route was being opened for controlled and time-limited periods to allow some foreign nationals and injured Palestinians to leave. What do we know about how tight that security operation is on those gates and who's running it?
I don't have a feel for it, but certainly I've been told the Israelis are involved. So if that's the case, they certainly understand more about who is Hamas and who is not Hamas. So given that's the case, I suspect the security situation is not perfect, but it's certainly likely pretty good if the Israelis are on the Gaza side of the gate of the port of entry.
President Biden says the opening of the crossing was the result of intense and urgent diplomacy. But he also talked about the 230 hostages and the chance of their release, and saying there is still hope, essentially, for those hostages. Well, what do we know, really, about the state and the conditions that they're in at the moment? Because with the bombing that's been so intense, it's been widely discussed that were they being held, many of them, their lives were at risk.
Oh, yeah, there's not that much about it. No doubt about the peril that they're in, for sure. Listen, it's uncharacteristic of the Hamas to take any significant number of hostages. That's why I believe the Iranians had the fingerprints all over this attack. We know full well the Hamas was training at the IRGC training camp in September in Iran. And hostage taking is a mantra of the Iranian regime since their inception in the early 80s. What I have been able to determine from the hostages that have been released and talking to my sources is that, for the most part, not being mistreated, and that may be dependent. I think there's 5 that have been released now. Secondly,
Yes.
they're not all together, so they're spread out, and that's not too surprising. But the Israelis, what they do know, they're not telling anybody. That's for sure. But it is a very dangerous situation. Look, they took the hostages for obvious leverage, and I suspect at the end of the day, the leaders will use the hostages to protect themselves as much as possible. I don't know that's a fact, but just speculating, dealing with the kind of morally bankrupt people who lead Hamas and their lack of respect for human life, period, and their likely concerns about their own selfishness in protecting their own life. But I think one of the things that the Israelis made a very good decision about, and I think it surprised most of us, is to go slow and gradual into the city, try to isolate Gaza City. That does a number of things for them. One, it helps to preserve their own force and reduce their own casualties because they know they're going to be there likely for months. Two, it gives them time to assess the intelligence situation as opposed to just going in and being firepower based. That gives them an assessment of where is the enemy and what is taking place. And obviously they're going to capture people and get information, immediate tactical information on what's in the area there that may complement what they already know. And three, I really believe the slow and gradual gives the hostages a better chance of surviving.
Jack, can I ask you about the chances of further escalation outside of Israel and Gaza in this conflict? Of course, we've heard that the US launched airstrikes against Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard troops in eastern Syria last week, and there have been further attacks, haven't there, by Iranian-backed militias, according to Pentagon officials, on America's military bases in Iraq and the Middle East. How likely do you think a further escalation is?
I think it's quite likely. I think the major escalation would come from Hezbollah, a force somewhere north of 60,000, has 130,000 rockets and missiles whose range, precision, and lethality are significantly greater than what Hamas has. Virtually every one of those rockets and missiles and drones that they have been given to them by the Iranians. The Iranians will make the decision, not Nasrallah, who's the head of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Iranians will make the decision whether Hezbollah starts firing off those rockets and missiles at the major cities inside Israel to try to overwhelm their air defense systems. That decision obviously has not been made. They've been doing some very measured, limited attacks into Israel for the purpose of forcing the Israelis to commit some measure of force in that area to protect their northern border, which would detract from using that force in Gaza. That is what is going on right now.
So what would be the Israeli Israeli response then, Jack, to that?
I think what will happen is I do believe that as the operation continues in the Gaza Strip, I do think it's likely that the Iranians will probably order the Hezbollah to begin to firing their missiles. I think they're going to use the casualties as a justification, and I believe they're waiting for those casualties to mount. I'm just speculating here, but the Iranians have gone to a lot of trouble in training Hamas for this operation, and some of the techniques and imagination that they displayed, I'm absolutely convinced came from the IRGC. So that's the expansion number one that we should be most concerned about. The United States, I think, is mistaken in doing such limited attacks against the 30-something attacks that have been conducted against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria since the assault began on 10/7. The reality is the United States should be taking down some of that capability that the proxies have in terms of their command and control, their rockets, their missiles, their drones, and significant amount of logistical infrastructure. We know where all their bases are, and we should be attacking a number of those already to deprive them of that capability to reattack. And I think we shouldn't be intimidated by doing that. I mean, my God, we've got about 24, 30 troops that have already been wounded in this. Most of them are concussion, brain type trauma injuries, but nonetheless potentially serious in the long term.
That's the Hezbollah and the Iranian positions you're talking about there. The Hezbollah and the Iranian positions.
I am talking about IRGC positions in Syria and Iraq.
Yes.
Those are proxy positions, yes. You know, the Iranians have been very successful in using proxies and not being directly involved in a confrontation themselves. It's been a brilliant strategy going all the way back when Reagan was president. They blew up our barracks in Lebanon through proxies, our embassy in Lebanon, our embassy in Kuwait, our barracks in the next decade in Saudi Arabia. And guess what? They want us out of the Middle East. That's the reason why we did it. We withdrew our troops out of Lebanon, and we withdrew our troops out of Saudi Arabia at the time. They still use this strategy for the single purpose of getting the United States out of the region. That is their objective in doing this, and they want the American people to question, why are our soldiers still in the Middle East? What are they doing there? Why are we risking their lives here? We should get them out of there. And some of that conversation is making it into the public spaces back here in America as we speak, exactly what the Iranians want.
That's General Jack Keane, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, retired four-star general and former vice chief of staff for the US Army, talking there about what could happen next in this war. The first British nationals have left Gaza via the Rafah border crossing from Gaza into Egypt, according to the Foreign Office.